Listening to Bad Dog Agility, bringing you training tips, interviews, and news about the great sport of dog agility.
I'm Jennifer.
And I'm Sarah, and this is episode 278. Today's podcast is brought to you by hitaboard.com and the new Teeter Teach It, an easy-to-use tool that controls the amount of tip on your teeter so you can introduce motion to your dog in a gradual way. Go to hitaboard.com for the new Teeter Teach It and other agility training tools and toys. Use discount code BDA10 to get 10% off your order. That's hitaboard.com. Today, we're going to talk about how to help your dog the right way. And I think right off the bat, that kind of implies that there's a wrong way. And we're going to talk about that too, because I think that a lot of people make mistakes when they are attempting a sequence that their dog has already failed and they're trying to get it right. And so we want to talk about some ways that you can help your dog that will help their learning rather than hold them back from learning. So let's take like a situation in practice where somebody is running a sequence and their dog falls for an off-course trap. And because it's practice, they get to try it again. And I think that a lot of times what happens is people end up overhandling the space where they had the error. They might call really hard. They might turn their shoulders more than they normally would, or they might completely face their dog and kind of call their dog to them. But they do all this stuff and their dog gets it. And they're like, yay, I got the sequence. But did your dog really learn anything? Because I think for a lot of people and a lot of dogs, anytime on course, you turn and face your dog and start yelling their name, they're going to come to you. They're not going to go, take these other obstacles. But that doesn't mean that the next time you are running a course and you come into this area with some sort of discrimination, that your dog is going to get it right because you didn't actually teach them anything. You were so focused on getting to the next correct obstacle that you didn't take the time to break down the challenge and teach your dog how to respond to your normal handling, not your yelling and screaming and call off handling. How often do you see that, Jennifer, in class?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head with the word learn, even with your intro. What is our dog really learning? And I think that's really what we got to focus on is it's that difference between a short-term fix, what I will always talk to, and those examples that you just used, that student in class, I said, well, you put a great Band-Aid on your dog. That's what you did. You turned, you screamed, you hollered, you got it done. But it was a Band-Aid. It wasn't learning. So when we think about, what does learn mean, right? Definition of learn: to acquire knowledge of or skill in by study, instruction, or experience. So that means that they're acquiring the knowledge or they have the skill, not just you got them through that sequence at that moment through a quick fix of screaming, clapping, facing your dog, all those things that you just said. So I think the scenario that you just built is very common. I see it all the time, particularly at trials, when the cue's on the line and they just want to do what it takes to get the job done. But the dog's not really learning the skill, right? They're just getting a temporary fix. So one of my favorite quotes I feel like really applies when we discussed this podcast, which is, don't give up what you want most of all for what you want right now. And I know I've mentioned that in past podcasts with contacts, where people will let the contacts go for the sake of the cue. But I think it applies here with handling and just overall learning and proficiency of a skill, that people get through something on the short term. They get through class, they run the sequence or course clean. So they get that short-term goal. But what did they accomplish long-term? Is the dog really learning it? Is the dog really understanding it? And that to me is just such an important part of this.
Right. And I think to build on your definition of learn, your dog is learning something when you do that. They're learning how to respond when you yell and scream and turn towards them, right? They can absolutely. They are actually building the skill of call-offs, right? Which, okay, there's a time and a place for that. we're not going to talk about learning when you are in the middle of a finals run with the championship on the line, right? We're not talking about learning in that scenario. There you do whatever it takes, right? You put all the Band-Aids on, just Band-Aid, like stack them on top of each other, right? But we're talking about practice primarily. And I think it carries over to trials, but let's start with practice because that's an area where it just, to me, as an instructor, does not make sense to focus on just getting through however you can get through, right? Because there's nothing on the line there, right? So take the time to do something to help your dog actually learn the skill they needed, not the skill of calling off. So let's give some examples of the right way, right? Because I think the motto that I always have is, don't change your handling, change the environment. And by that, I mean, if you handled it the way you intended, right? If your handling was correct, your timing was correct, and your dog just didn't respond, or maybe they're not quite strong enough in that skill, but your handling was the way you wanted it, don't suddenly change your handling because then whatever they do learn is not the real handling, even if it's not as extreme as our example of yelling and screaming and calling off the dog. But even if you slow your motion down when you don't ultimately want to do that, or rotate a little bit more than what you normally want to do, they're going to learn that more exaggerated handling, and that's not going to help them in the long term. So I like to change the environment. And so I have a couple of different ways to do that. Let's talk about the first one. The first one is placement of reward. So you can use placement of reward to help influence what your dog does. So let's say that my dog falls for an off-course trap. And when I go back and try it again, I'm going to, as they are taking the obstacle before the off-course trap, I'm going to toss my reward on the line I want my dog to be on. And this first time, that absolutely may be a lure, right? They may have been headed for that off-course tunnel, but the toy comes out, in between the two jumps that I want them to take, and they come off the tunnel and get the toy. Then the next time, when I throw the toy on the line that I want them on, they're a little bit less wide. And then by the third time, they've got it. They've figured out the path. And then I can just delay that toy throw, right? So that's kind of a breakdown of how I would use placement of reward to kind of systematically teach the dog while my handling remains the same. All of those repetitions, including the one where my dog took the off course and the one that my dog went wide. If my handling was correct the first time, and it's just an understanding thing, my handling is going to stay the same. The difference is going to be that reward placement, and that's going to help the dog get it right. And then once they get it right, they get the reward. And once they get the reward, they're more likely to do it right the next time. So I really like placement of reward for teaching like in the moment. Is that something that you use in your classes, or how do you have people use their rewards?
Absolutely. I think a huge part of any of the dog's learning, whether we're talking handling and we're talking reinforcing on agility lines, or just kind of basic dog training, you're shaping a behavior with a 12-week-old puppy, placement of reward can be so critical in the dog's understanding of a specific behavior. So the example of what you use there, placement of reward, a super great example of changing the environment. The one that I will often go to is another way we can manipulate the environment for better learning is, and I think this one being super relevant for agility, is decreasing the speed. I just had this example earlier this morning. I'll use the example of a tunnel discrimination. I was teaching a lesson and the dog was struggling with a U-shaped tunnel discrimination. So it was taking the one directly in front of it instead of the one nearest her. What she elected to do was she's like, well, I'm going to decel and I'm going to use the dog's name because her tunnel threadle verbal was not working. And I said, okay, that's fine. We can do that. But what happens when you're not ahead to be able to decelerate? What happens when there's not as much distance? The using of the dog's name already indicates that your tunnel threadle verbal broke, right? If your tunnel threadle verbal was working, you wouldn't need the name. So we just broke down the amount of momentum and back chained. So maybe back chaining would kind of be another word to think of the same thing. So Instead of doing jump to the tunnel, we just put the dog on the landing of the jump. Got rid of the momentum, let the dog be a little bit more, a little slower, a little calmer, worked the throttle. Then we went back from one jump and we slowly worked ourselves back to building up the full speed. And in this case, the speed and the distance kind of go hand in hand of building up the speed and distance that it took for the dog to successfully understand the skill. So where she wanted that short-term Band-Aid of, well, let me just decel and use the dog's name, I said, absolutely not. Let's just break it down, eliminate some of the speed and distance that was causing the dog to struggle in the first place and build back. So there would be a second way to control that environment or to manipulate that environment for better learning is speed and distance.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think, let's build on the idea of making it easier, making the actual sequence easier. Another way that I will approach that is, for instance, maybe I'm going to lower jumps, right? So if it's a difficult, maybe it's a difficult backside, maybe it's a difficult throttle, maybe it's a difficult serpentine. A lot of times those maneuvers become a little bit easier when the jump is a little bit lower. So I might lower jumps. If it is weave pulls, I might open them up. Right. So I'm not going to change. I'm not going to suddenly go and get in my dog's face trying to get that entry. Instead, I'm going to open up the weave pulls just a little bit, just enough to help the dog be right, and then slowly close them up. So, those are ways that you can make the obstacles themselves a little bit more easy and inviting. It's almost like taking some of the thought pressure away from one aspect, right? So you don't have to think so hard, my dog, you don't have to think so hard about the jumping mechanics because the bars are low. Now you can concentrate more on what I'm doing and my handling and things like that. So taking away a little bit of that pressure. And then another way, and this can become a little bit more difficult, like in a class environment, but is to change the environment such that the problem is less likely to happen. So in the case of an off course, I might move the off course away. It would still be kind of relative. The layout would be relatively the same, but maybe it's 3 feet further away from the dog's line. And see if I can get my dog successful at the sequence and then move it back. And then sometimes I'll even go the other direction. And once they're doing it right, I'm going to challenge them by moving it even closer to their intended path to really make sure that they had understanding. But again, my handling is going to keep looking the same. I just made them a little bit more likely to be right because when they're right, I can reward. And when I can reward, then that's when the learning is going to take place.
I absolutely love it because that's one of my go-to moves, probably more than almost any of the other things that we've already mentioned is changing the difficulty of the sequence by making in the situation of an off course, putting that off course further away. Your dog is not coming in on a serpentine because there's an off course tunnel out there or an off course jump. I'm just going to move it further away and keep moving it further away until the dog has the successful line. Just like you said, handling stays the same. And every time you reinforce, the dog is that much more likely to do that and then bring it in to the point of exactly what you said, almost to the point where I'll bring it in so close. I'll make sure my dog can do it with that off course 4 feet away, which I know we would never see in competition, but to work through it that way. So love, love, love that idea. I do that a lot with both my own dogs and the students' dogs.
Yeah. And it's not just off courses. Like think about the failure that your dog did and what it would take to make it easier. So for example, a backside, right? Not all backsides are created equal, right? Not all backsides require the same amount from the dog. We use a backside cue even if the dog is heading like almost at the wing, like the heading sideways at the jump, we still use that backside cue and it's just not as extreme. And so you could take a backside where the dog is really going perpendicular to the jump. They have to really go all the way to the backside, 180 degrees turn to take the jump. And you can just rotate that jump so that now when they go to the backside, they only have to go, 90 degrees or, 120 degrees or something like that. But you can make these things easier. So it's distances matter. So like typically a serpentine is easier when it's not as spread out. A threadle is easier when it's more spread out, right? So you have to kind of learn like what aspects of this challenge make it more or less difficult. And then those are the things that you're going to change on course and then gradually change back so that your dog can learn it. And this goes hand in hand with another idea. And I know that there is an article on it, and I can't remember if we ever did a podcast on it, but the idea of on-the-job training. And I use that to mean when my dog makes a mistake, I want to work on it when at all possible. I want to work on it right then when they made the mistake. I don't want to just mentally say, okay, my dog doesn't have a good threadle. I'll go home and work on that. I want to work on it right there because every threadle you encounter is slightly different. And every time your dog makes a mistake, there are different aspects of it that may have contributed to the mistake. And you have that picture right there in front of you. Like that's the time to try to work through it. And I think that a ton of learning can happen just by setting up sequences, attempting them, working through any mistakes, like right then and there, and then moving on to the next sequence. And, some of our dogs, that is essentially the majority of their training is just like once they've learned the basics of handling, the majority of their training is just throwing different sequences at them and working through every mistake they make. So I think we've given everybody some great strategies for how to help their dog after a mistake is made. And I think that this is how I approach training for sure. And this is how I coach people, in terms of when they send me a mistake, or if I'm working with them live, I'm not focused on getting the sequence right. I'm focused on getting the handling right. And if the handling's right and the dog's still making a mistake, in helping the dog work through that, or letting the handler know what additional training outside of the practice with me that they need to build that skill up to the level where they can handle it. Because sometimes you're going to, especially all of the instructors in there, right? The instructors listening, there are going to be times where somebody fails a sequence and there is just no way for them to get it right then, right there, right? Like if the skill isn't there, there are some sequences that they just can't get through. And so you have to be able to guide people through, where the deficits are so that they can work on those. And then, that's a skill that they will have on down the line. And I think then as handlers, I want people to understand that is the case also, right? I can't always give you something that's going to work for every sequence right now. It's going to depend on the skills that you have and the skills that your dog has. And then everything else on top of that is just going to be about identifying what needs work so that you can direct your training. All right. Well, that's it for this week's podcast. We'll have in the show notes, we will have links to some of these other articles that we referenced because I think there's some really good demo video of helping your dog be right without changing your handling. And that will really help everybody out. We'd like to thank our sponsor, hititboard.com. Happy training.